which bit all of us except for Helmut and Kurt, who were wearing special ant-proof socks, which they had brought with them from Latvia. We complimented them on their foresight, and they shrugged and said it was nothing. Latvians are always well prepared. They looked at our recording equipment and said that they were surprised that we thought it was adequate. They had much better tape recorders than that in Latvia. We said that that might very well be so, but that we were very happy with it, and the BBC seemed to think it was fine for the job. Helmut, or was it Kurt, explained that they had much better broadcasting corporations in Latvia. The outbreak of outright hostilities was happily averted at this moment by a signal from our guides to keep quiet. We were near the guerrillas. "But of course," said Kurt, with a slight smile playing along his thin Latvian lips, as if he'd known all the while that this is exactly where the guerrillas would be. But it wasn't a gorilla itself that had attracted our guide's attention. It was a gorilla's bed. By the side of the track along which we were walking, there was a large depression in the undergrowth where a gorilla had been sleeping for the night. Plant stems had been pulled down and folded under to keep the gorilla off the ground, which was cold and damp at night. One of the characteristics that laymen find most odd about zoologists is their insatiable enthusiasm for animal droppings. I can understand, of course, that the droppings yield a great deal of information about the habits and diets of the animals concerned, but nothing quite explains the sheer glee that the actual objects seem to inspire. A sharp yelp of joy told me that Mark had found some. He dropped to his knees and started to fire off his Nikon at a small pile of gorilla dung. "It's in the nest," he explained once he had finished, which is very interesting, you see. The mountain gorillas, the ones that live here, actually defecate in their nests because it's too cold to get up at night. The western lowland gorillas, on the other hand, don't. They live in a warmer climate, so getting up in the middle of the night is less of a problem. Also, the western lowland gorillas live on a diet of fruit, which is another incentive for not shitting in their nests. "I see," I said. Helmut started to say something which I like to think was probably something about having far superior types of gorilla dung in Latvia, but I interrupted him because I suddenly had one of those strange, uncanny feelings that I was being watched by a truck. We kept very quiet and looked very carefully around us. There was nothing we could see near us, nothing in the trees above us, nothing peering furtively from the bushes. It was a moment or two before we saw anything at all, but then at last a slight movement caught our eyes. About 30 yards away down the track we were following, standing in plain view, was something so big that we hadn't even noticed it. It was a mountain gorilla. Or perhaps I should say a gorilla mountain, standing propped up on its front knuckles so that it assumed the shape of a large and muscular sloping ridge tent. You will have heard it said before that these creatures are awesome beasts, and I would like to add my own particular perception to this. These creatures are awesome beasts. It is hard to know how better to put it. A kind of humming mental paralysis grips you when you first encounter a creature such as this in the wild, and indeed there is no creature such as this. All sorts of wild and vertiginous feelings well up into your brain that you seem to have no connection with and no name for, perhaps because it is thousands or millions of years since such feelings were last aroused. I'm going to be a bit fanciful for a moment because it's very hard not to be when your rational, civilized brain, I use the words in the loosest possible sense, experiences things it has no way of recognizing or accounting for, but which are nevertheless very powerful. I've heard an idea proposed, I've no idea how seriously, to account for the sensation of vertigo. It's an idea that I instinctively like, and it goes like this. The dizzy sensation we experience when standing in high places is not simply a fear of falling. It's often the case that the only thing likely to make us fall is the actual dizziness itself, so it is at best an extremely irrational, even self-fulfilling fear. However, in the distant past of our evolutionary journey towards our current state, we lived in trees. We leapt from tree to tree. There are even those who speculate that we may have something bird-like in our ancestral line, in which case there may be some part of our mind that, when confronted with the void, expects to be able to leap out into it, and even urges us to do so. So what you end up with is a conflict between a primitive, atavistic part of our mind, which is saying, jump! And the more modern, rational part of your mind, which is saying, for Christ's sake, don't! Certainly the dizzy experience of vertigo seems to have far more in common with feelings of oscillating mental conflict and confusion than it does with simple fear. If it's a fear, it's one we love to play with and tease ourselves with, which is how designers of Big Dippers and Ferris wheels make a living. The feeling I had looking at my first silverback gorilla in the wild was vertiginous. It was as if there was something I was meant to do, some reaction that was expected of me, and I didn't know what it was or how to do it. My modern mind was simply saying, run away, but all I could do was stand, trembling, and stare. The right moment for something seemed to slip away and fall into an unbridgeable gulf between us and the gorilla, and left us simply gawping helplessly on our side. The gorilla, meanwhile, seemed to notice that we had been busy photographing its dung and merely stalked off into the undergrowth. We set off to follow it, but it was in its own element and we were not. We were not even able to tell whereabouts in its own element it was, and after a while we gave up and started to explore the area more generally again. The gorilla we had seen was a large male silverback. Silverback simply means that its back was silver, or grey-haired. Only the backs of males turn silver, and it happens after the male has reached maturity. Tradition has it that only the chief male of a group will develop a silverback, and that it will happen within days or even hours of it taking over as leader. But this apparently is nonsense. Popular and beguiling nonsense, but nonsense. And while we are on the subject of nonsense, I should mention something we discovered a few days later, when talking to Conrad Aveling, a field researcher in Goma, who has for years been responsible for gorilla conservation work in the area. We told Conrad how alarmed we had been by Morara and Serendora's accounts of simply going out and mowing down the local poachers, and he sat back in his chair, kicked up his heels, and roared with laughter. It's incredible what these guys will tell the tourists. I bet they told you they were ex-commandos as well, did they? We admitted rather sheepishly that they had. Conrad clasped his hand to his brow and shook his head. The only thing about them that's ex-commando, he said, is their uniforms. They buy them off the commandos. The commandos sell them to buy food because they hardly ever get paid. It's all complete nonsense. I heard another great story the other day. A tourist had asked a guide, and this was at Rawindi, where there are no gorillas. The tourist asked, what happens when a gorilla meets a lion? And instead of answering, well, that's a silly question, because lions and gorillas live in completely different areas and would never meet, the guide obviously feels obliged to think of some sort of colourful answer. So he says, what happens is that the gorilla beats the hell out of the lion, then wraps his body in leaves and twigs and then stamps on him. I only heard about it myself because the tourist came to me afterwards and said how fascinated he'd been to hear about it. It bothers me when they make up these colourful answers. I wish I could make them understand that if they don't know the answer, or they think the right answer isn't very interesting, it's better to say so rather than just invent absolute nonsense. One thing that was beyond dispute, however, was that when our guides were not inventing stuff or acting out Rambo fantasies, they really knew the forest, and they really knew the gorillas. They had, and Conrad Aveling confirmed this enthusiastically, themselves habituated 2 of the gorilla groups for human contact. Habituating is a very long, complicated and delicate business, but briefly it is the process of contacting a group in the wild and visiting them every day, if you can find them, over a period of months or even years, and training them to accept the presence of human beings, so that they can then be studied and also visited by tourists. The length of time it takes to habituate gorillas depends on the dominant silverback. He's the one whose confidence you have to win. In the case of the family group we were visiting, it took fully 3 years. Conrad Aveling spent the first 8 months of his time on the project crawling around in the undergrowth with them, but never actually saw them once, though he was often no more than 20 or 30 feet away. One of the problems of habituating in this sort of habitat, he explained, is that it's so thick you can't see each other, and what happens is you end up having these sudden confrontations at about 3 or 4 meters or less, and you still can't see each other. Everybody's jumping out of their skin, the gorilla's jumping out of his skin, I'm jumping out of mine. It's extremely exciting, and you get a real adrenaline rush. A problem with the Bukavu group was that the silverback wouldn't charge. I actually wanted him to, because then, having charged, he would expose himself and then realise that I didn't mean him any harm. But he wouldn't do that, he just kept circling. Usually they do charge, and if they do, you have this face-to-face, and you have a moment to understand that neither of you means the other any harm, and the gorilla backs off. "But you go into a submissive posture, do you?" asked Mark. "You don't confront him." "No, I usually don't go into a submissive posture. I'm usually too frightened to move." Once a silverback accepts humans, the rest of the group will quickly fall into line, and, interestingly enough, any other groups in the area will usually become habituated much more quickly. There's hardly ever any trouble, provided everybody treats everybody else with respect. The gorillas are perfectly capable of making it clear when they don't wish to be disturbed. There was one occasion on which a gorilla group had had a particularly stressful morning as a result of an encounter with another gorilla group, and the last thing they wanted was to be bothered with humans in the afternoon. So when a tracker brought some tourists and overstayed his welcome, the silverback took hold of the tracker's hand and gently